Bible speaks of men who lived for centuries, as if they had inhabited another world. Ancient Sumerian tablets record kings with reigns lasting millennia. Exaggerated myth or memory of something real. In India, the Golden Ages promised impossible longevity. Forbidden texts whisper secrets of fallen angels and forgotten knowledge. Why do so many different cultures tell the same story with different faces? Today we're going to piece together these scattered clues to attempt to answer a forbidden question. What happened to the knowledge that made us different? And why did they want us to forget? Stick around, because in this new session, we're going to explore these and many more mysteries together. Welcome to Código Divino. Why stop to ask all this? Because these aren't just simple legends meant to entertain the ancients. They're stories that, though separated by thousands of kilometers and cultures, share the same unsettling pattern. Humans living impossible lifespans, golden ages that ended in punishment, a lost knowledge that marked the difference between what we were and what we are. Understanding these stories isn't just about reviewing ancient myths. It's about searching for traces of something that might be true. If so many civilizations agree in remembering a time of extraordinary longevity, isn't it worth asking what they knew that we have forgotten? Today, we're going to explore those clues, to rebuild that broken map. We'll start with the best-known account, that of the Bible and its long-lived patriarchs. But we won't stop there. We're going to decipher symbols, compare cultures, and chase the echo of a knowledge that may have been erased forever. Because only by connecting all these pieces can we attempt to answer the most uncomfortable question of all. What happened to what made us different? To begin untangling this mystery, we need to look at the best known and at the same time most enigmatic account, the Bible. Because even though many read it today as a purely religious text, the Bible also holds fragments of something much older. Records that speak of different eras, of conditions impossible to imagine today. What is it trying to tell us when it describes men living entire centuries? Is it telling history, myth, warning, or an encrypted code? Today we're going to dive into these almost mythical names. Adam, Noah, Methuselah, men who, according to scripture, lived hundreds of years as if they belonged to another kind of humanity. But are these numbers literal? Or do they have a meaning we've forgotten how to decode? Because when we read that, Methuselah lived 969 years, it's not just a number, it's a message. A message that perhaps wasn't meant for everyone, but only for those who knew how to interpret it. We're going to examine these numbers. We're going to ask if they're symbolic, calendrical, or a coded language for initiates. Because only then can we begin to understand what they were trying to tell us and why that knowledge was lost. Bible, long-lived patriarchs. When we open the oldest pages of the Bible, we discover something deeply unsettling. We don't just find spiritual teachings or moral tales. There's something else. Something that seems to whisper from the past about a world we no longer understand. They're the genealogies, detailed lists of generations, but with one detail impossible to ignore. In Genesis chapter 5, we read that Adam lived 930 years, Genesis 5:5. Seth lived 912 years, Genesis 5:8. Enosh, 905, Genesis 5:11. Jared, 962, Genesis 5:20. Enoch, known for walking with God, lived 365 years before being taken and vanishing without dying, Genesis 5:23 through 24. And Methuselah, the oldest, reached 969 years. So within the biblical chronology, this happens. The pattern that changes. After the flood, Genesis itself shows a radical change. Lifespans drop dramatically. Shem, son of Noah, lived 600 years, Genesis 11:10 through 11. Arphaxad, 438 years. Shelah, 433. Eber, 464. But generations later, ages fall below 200 years. It's as if humanity's longevity was deliberately interrupted, leaving only the echo of what we once were. Already knowing this, there's a mysterious and powerful point: the enigma of numerical symbolism. But these numbers aren't random figures tossed casually. They're specific, detailed, written with the same solemnity as laws or covenants. That's why for centuries there's been debate. How should we interpret them? Are they literal? Some believe so, that before the flood there was a different biological condition. The Bible itself suggests a change in human nature after that cataclysm. In Genesis 6:3, God says, "My spirit will not remain with man forever, because he is indeed flesh. His days shall be 120 years." As if a limit was set. This literal view suggests a world with different environmental conditions, less radiation, a protective atmosphere, or even genetics not yet degraded by accumulated mutations. Or are they symbolic? Here the story becomes even more intriguing. In ancient cultures, numbers didn't just count things, they meant things. In Judaism, numerology, or gematria, assigns mystical values to words and numbers. 7 represents divine perfection or spiritual completeness. 12 symbolizes organization and totality, the tribes of Israel, the apostles. 40 often indicates periods of trial or transformation. The flood lasted 40 days. Moses spent 40 years in the desert. So, what does 969 mean? Although the Bible doesn't openly explain its symbolism, scholars have proposed that its form, almost 1,000, could indicate the idea of almost perfect, almost immortal, but still mortal. A reminder of closeness to eternity, cut short by the fall and the flood. Additionally, in Hebrew structure, numbers often had patterns. The use of numbers with 9 and 6, both considered important in numerological systems, might have been a way to encode esoteric meaning. In other words, they wouldn't be just ages, but encrypted messages. Other theories go further. Some researchers believe that the biblical authors used these numbers to preserve astronomical knowledge. Some suggest that such long lifespans could allude to cosmic or calendrical cycles now forgotten. Others think they reflect a different way of measuring time, that the years could be lunar cycles, seasons, or ritual counts. But even so, the numbers would still reveal lives much longer than what we consider possible today. There are even those who point to oral traditions predating the biblical text, where these numbers were clues for initiates. Secret knowledge, transmitted in coded form so it wouldn't be completely lost, but also couldn't be understood by just anyone. In this sense, the long-lived patriarchs would be like guardians of a mystery, not just biological ancestors, but living symbols of a different humanity, closer to the gods, bearers of knowledge that would later be forbidden or destroyed. And the big question remains, are these numbers a literal record of another era, or warnings and symbols designed for the few who could decipher them? Perhaps they are both. Traces of a time that was lost, and of knowledge that was deliberately buried. The most unsettling thing about these biblical genealogies isn't just their impossible numbers or their encoded symbolism. It's that they seem to preserve the memory of a different kind of humanity. A time when life was measured in centuries. A time that ended abruptly. The Bible makes it clear. The flood marks the breaking point before nearly eternal lives, after strict limits and a more fragile humanity. But the Bible isn't alone in describing this pattern. Long before Genesis was written, the Sumerians carved onto clay tablets a list of their ancient kings. And in that list, we find something astonishing. Kings who ruled for thousands of years. But even there, just like in the Bible, there's a decisive moment, a great flood that divides history in two, as if different civilizations remembered the same catastrophic event. each with its own language, its own myth. To better understand this enigma, we have to travel even further back in time, to Sumer, to the civilization that called itself the Black-Headed People and left behind the first written stories of humanity. Sumerian King List. If we want to see whether the Bible is the only one that talks about impossible lifespans, we have to look even further back, before Abraham, before Moses, to the lands of Sumer, the civilization that invented writing and recorded its stories on clay tablets. So, what is the Sumerian King List? On those tablets, we find a fascinating text, the Sumerian King List. It's a document that lists the kings of Sumer from the most ancient times. It includes their names, the cities they ruled, and the number of years their reigns lasted. But those numbers are anything but normal. Another very intriguing detail is this impossible reigns. According to this list, some kings ruled for 28,800 years, others for 36,000. There's even one with over 43,000 years. These are figures that defy all logic, and yet they're written with the same seriousness as the later lists of kings who reigned for decades or less. For the Sumerians, these were their chronicles, not children's myths. This was their official history. The Sumerian king list also marks a clear before and after. After the flood, reigns no longer last thousands of years. They drop to hundreds, then to tens. Exactly the same pattern we find in the Bible: impossible lifespans before the flood, and limited longevity afterward. In Genesis, the flood is a divine break, a reset for humanity. Before, patriarchs who lived nearly 1,000 years, after, generations with shorter and shorter lives. In Sumer, the flood also resets kingship. How do we explain that two such different cultures remember the same catastrophic event as the boundary of human longevity? Coincidence? Or a shared memory of something real? Some historians suggest that these impossible figures were symbolic, a way of saying that these kings were semi-divine, different from ordinary humans. Others think they encoded astronomical cycles, calendrical knowledge that we no longer understand. Or perhaps they were a warning disguised as history, a memory of a humanity that lost something essential after the flood. This is where these key questions arise. Why did the Sumerians, thousands of years before the Bible, write their own version of impossible longevity? Why do both cultures mark the flood as the moment when everything changed? Are we looking at independent myths, or fragments of the same event seen through different eyes? Perhaps these lists aren't fantasies or tales. Perhaps they are encoded warnings, traces of an older humanity, longer lived, wiser, but destroyed forever. And the flood wouldn't just be a divine punishment, but the final act of erasing knowledge that was never meant to survive. But this idea of long-lived ancestors isn't an isolated myth. It doesn't belong only to the Bible or to the Sumerian tablets. It's a pattern that repeats in cultures separated by oceans and millennia, as if all of humanity shared an echo of something that refuses to die. India Hindu tradition describes the yugas, vast cosmic ages that define humanity's morality, wisdom, and longevity. During the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, it was said that humans lived thousands of years, free from disease and corruption, in perfect communion with spiritual knowledge. As the Yugas advanced, Treta, Dvapara, and finally Kali Yuga, that longevity and purity degraded. Today, according to this vision, we live in the Kali Yuga, the darkest and shortest era. It's not just a moral tale. It's the idea that humanity lost something essential, even its own lifespan. Ancient Egypt also preserved this memory. Before the human pharaohs, they spoke of the divine dynasties, gods and demigods who ruled for thousands or tens of thousands of years. The Turin King List records these impossible reigns with figures that defy our understanding. Among these rulers were the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, beings considered semi-divine who reigned before historical time. for the ancient Egyptians, these weren't mere myths. They were part of their official history, a past where kings were almost gods, with longevity reflecting their superior nature. Mesoamerica. The Nahua people spoke of the 5 suns, entire cycles of creation and destruction. Each sun represented a complete era that ended in catastrophe, wiping out the previous humanity. In these past eras, ancestors were described as stronger, wiser, closer to the gods, until pride and chaos brought their destruction and forced a reset. Here too, we find the idea of lost longevity and greatness after a universal punishment. Ancient China. Foundational myths mention the 3 August Ones and 5 emperors, civilizing heroes and demigods who taught arts, laws, and knowledge. According to records like the Shiji, some of these rulers lived hundreds of years, with reigns so long they symbolized order, wisdom, and a purer connection to heaven. Over time, dynasties became more human and more fragile. And then the big question arises: why do such different cultures, with no apparent contact, tell such similar stories? Long-lived ancestors, semi-divine kings, golden ages ending in destruction. Are these simple coincidences or distorted fragments of the same ancient truth? Perhaps these legends don't just try to explain the past. Perhaps they are veiled warnings, a memory of what humanity was once capable of being and of what it lost forever. Apocryphal texts and forbidden knowledge. But the clues about a different humanity don't end in official texts. There are forbidden, marginalized writings that seem to tell another version of history. One of the most enigmatic is the Book of Enoch, an apocryphal text excluded from the biblical canon, but which circulated for centuries among the peoples of the ancient Near East. In it, it is told how certain angels, the Watchers, descended to Earth and shared with humans knowledge they were not meant to have: metallurgy, astrology, magic, advanced knowledge for their time. But the most unsettling idea is that this forbidden knowledge included secrets about life itself. What if those fallen angels taught how to prolong life beyond its natural limits? What if the impossible longevity of the patriarchs or the millennia-long reigns of ancient kings were the echo of that corrupted knowledge? For Enoch, those gifts weren't blessings. They were transgressions that upset the order of the world and condemned humanity to the flood. Modern scientific perspective, DNA, epigenetics, and manipulation. And even though today we like to think we've outgrown ancient superstitions, we haven't stopped chasing the same secrets. Modern science is obsessed with longevity. Laboratories all over the world study DNA and epigenetics to understand why we age. They search for ways to reverse the process, to edit our genes, to stop the biological clock. There are theories suggesting that the keys to living hundreds of years might be encoded in our own genome, switched off or blocked by mutations accumulated over centuries. Other researchers explore genetic manipulation, dreaming of reconstructing something we may already have had and lost. And here the most uncomfortable question arises: what if this knowledge isn't new? What if it had already been achieved before? What if the myths of men who lived for centuries aren't fantasies, but fragments of a forbidden history that was deliberately erased? Perhaps ancient civilizations preserved in the form of myths, veiled warnings about the dangers of a power humanity wasn't ready to control. A knowledge capable of granting us extraordinarily long lives at the price of losing ourselves. Because maybe the real question isn't whether we can become like that again, but whether we should even try. When we look at all these scattered pieces, an impossible to ignore pattern emerges. In the Bible, we find patriarchs who lived for centuries, with lifespans that collapse after the flood, marking a definitive break in human history. In Sumer, the kings of the kingless ruled for thousands of years before another great flood that, according to their own tablets, completely reset humanity. In India, the vision of the Yugas describes vast cosmic eras in which humans lived thousands of years, in communion with spiritual knowledge and moral purity. before degrading into the Kali Yuga, the shortest and darkest era in which we live today. Egypt preserved the memory of divine dynasties, kings and demigods who reigned for tens of thousands of years. The Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, guardians of a lost time when humanity was closer to the divine. In Mesoamerica, the Nahua peoples spoke of the 5 suns, complete cycles of creation and destruction, where each era ended in catastrophe and reset. In those past ages, ancestors were described as longer-lived, wiser, closer to the gods, until their pride or corruption caused the end. In ancient China, the 3 august ones and 5 emperors were civilizing heroes and demigods who taught arts and laws with reigns of hundreds of years that symbolized order, wisdom, and a purer connection to heaven before the dynasties became human and fragile. But the clues don't end in the official texts. There are forbidden writings that tell another version of history. The Book of Enoch describes how fallen angels, the Watchers, descended to share knowledge that was not meant to be given to humans: metallurgy, astrology, magic, and perhaps secrets to prolong life beyond natural limits. Enoch describes those gifts as transgressions that upset the order of the world and condemned humanity to the flood. Today, even though we believe we've outgrown ancient superstitions, we're still chasing the same secrets. Modern science is obsessed with longevity. It studies DNA and epigenetics to understand aging, seeks to reverse it, edit our genes, and stop the biological clock. There are theories suggesting that the keys to living hundreds of years might be encoded in our own genome, switched off or blocked by accumulated mutations. Others dream of manipulating genetics to reconstruct something we may have already had and lost. And here, the most uncomfortable question arises. What if this knowledge isn't new? What if it had already been achieved before? What if the myths of men who lived for centuries aren't fantasies, but fragments of a forbidden history that was deliberately erased? Perhaps ancient civilizations preserved, in the form of myths, veiled warnings about the dangers of a power humanity wasn't ready to control. A knowledge capable of granting us incredibly long lives, at the cost of losing ourselves. Why did such different cultures tell such similar stories? Are they simple coincidences or scattered fragments of the same buried memory? What if we were once different, longer lived, wiser, more connected to something greater, until we lost it forever? What happened to that knowledge? Was it punished, forbidden, forgotten, or deliberately erased so we could never be like that again? Today, even science chases that same dream. But perhaps the real question isn't whether we can do it again, but whether we should even try. Because at the heart of all these myths lies a warning that every time humanity reached for something so powerful, it paid a price impossible to forget. And if we listen carefully, maybe that's the true secret all these stories wanted us to remember.